guys, so I'm here today to do my last monthly wrap up of 2019. So I read 11 books in the month of December and I have a bit of a mixture of genres here. So rather than do, I usually go from my least favourite to my most favourite, I'm going to do it like within each genre and talk about the books I read. So I read 4 YA fantasy books and I have just uploaded a video talking about all of the YA books I read in 2019, so I touched on all 4 of these books there. So I'll link that up here in case you want to hear a bit more about how I felt about these books in context of all the YA I read in 2019. But just to go over them again, I read The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black. This is the 3rd book in a trilogy, the 3rd and final book, so I can't really say much. I think the books have got like weaker as they've gone, and I think that's because she can't really do plot. This book, when it arrived, I was kindly sent this from the publisher. I was really surprised because it was only 300 pages and I was thinking, God, that seems like not much space to get from where we are to like an ending that makes sense, and basically we don't. So obviously I don't want to spoil anything, but if you've read the books, you know where the book ended last time. There was this big plot twist. The plot twist ended up being treated like it was this really like blasé thing, like just got brushed off, and I think that's a really disappointing thing to do, to give a book a really big finale and then the next book be like, oh, that was no big deal, like who cares? I found that odd. I can barely even remember the way this pulled together in the end because it was so just messy and it didn't really make sense. So, and I felt throughout that the main character's motivations don't make sense. So yeah, I love reading these. I speed through them. They're like a joy to read. I can't put them down. So I can't say I haven't really loved reading these books this year, but as actual books, there's a lot of problems with them. So there's my thoughts on that one. So I'd probably give that one like 2 stars. Then I also read The Deafness Girls by Kiran, Millwood, Hargrave. This is the first book of hers I've read, and I think she predominantly writes for children, for middle grade readers, and this is a YA fantasy, as I said. So I'd heard that this was based on, sorry, it's a library copy, so it's a bit shiny. I'd heard it was based on Dracula's Brides, and I knew that it started with 2 sisters and follows them as they get taken, and that there's maybe a female-female romance. That's what I knew. So I think the first 2/3 of this book is quite good. I read the first 2/3 in one sitting and then sort of walked away and thought, oh, do you know what, like I've read that super quickly and been really pulled in by it, but actually now I've stepped away from it even for like 10 minutes. I'm recognising that it's actually not that great. So it opens with these 2 sisters who are part of a travelling family, and they are about to be given their fates. So their palms are going to be read and they're going to be told the woman they'll become. But on the day that happens, their whole family and their travelling group get attacked, and they are the sole survivors other than their younger brother, who manages to flee separately to them. And they get taken to a castle where they're going to be made slaves. And there's lots of insinuations that once they've been there a while, they'll be made sex slaves. And you follow the story from one of the sisters' perspectives, who's like the quieter one and the less attractive one, and her sister's the complete opposite to her. Shock horror. And it goes from there. Do you know what? I felt like it was a bit slower than I expected YA to be at the start, which I appreciated. I think she can write beautifully. Her descriptions of the landscape, she really, like when she described the kitchen in this castle, I could really picture it. The romance was ridiculous. There was no grounds for it. It happens within like a week. It makes no sense. I think she just put that in there for a little bit of something extra, but didn't really bother to develop it. And then the end was ridiculous. It felt like she got to a certain point and she suddenly thought, oh shit, I'm supposed to be making this somehow tie in to Dracula's Brides. I've got 20 pages left. How can I do it? And it just was really messy. And in terms of the characters we'd got to know, their decisions made no sense to me. So yeah, I know she has an adult book coming out next year, and I was sort of intrigued by it, but after reading this, I feel like it's not likely I'm going to read it because I just didn't think this was handled particularly well. So then I decided to pick up some Margaret Rogerson because I'd heard that she was quite similar to Holly Black, and I wanted to read more books that were sort of like that dark fairy realm thing, because I used to read a lot of that as a teenager and it was just giving me loads of nostalgia. So I picked up from the library an Enchantment of Ravens. I've taken this book back, so I haven't got it anymore, but it's such a beautiful cover. And there's really mixed feelings about this one. I read it super quickly. I think I probably read it in one sitting, just like on the sofa in one evening. Sorry, I just had to cough there. So as I said, I read it in one sitting, and I would say she writes more beautifully about the Fae world than Holly Black does. So in this story, we're following a young woman who lives in like an in-between land. So it's this small village where it's always summer, and it's on the border of the human world and the Fae world. So fairies come into their realm and they have no like artistic capabilities, so they come into this borderland for humans to do like artistic things for them, like make dresses, or in our main character's case, she paints portraits of the fairies. And right at the start, a really famous fairy, like a royal fairy, comes to her and he wants his picture painted, and she accidentally paints true emotion into his eyes, which isn't something fairies are supposed to have. So he comes along, kidnaps her and takes her away to try and have her tried in a fairy court. And then obviously romance. So I thought it was beautifully written. It turns out that the fairy realm is divided by seasons, and he's the autumn king and is beautiful. And when he's in the autumn realm, he can control nature. It's so like pretty in the way it's written. I really enjoyed that. I thought she was a pretty strong main character. I liked him, and yeah, I was really enjoying it. And then the ending was a real mess, like a real mess. It didn't make any sense. It was so quickly wrapped up. I really didn't appreciate it at all. I was actually just sitting there like whiplash, like what's happening here? And then also when I'd stepped away from the book, even for like a day, I thought to myself, I feel like the romance was actually pretty poorly developed. And whilst I really like wanted them to be together just because that's what you're supposed to want, actually when I took a bit of time away from it, I was like, I don't think I really would have cared all that much if I'd read it over the space of a few days. So really mixed feelings, because on the one hand I could say it was like a 4-star read because I sped through it, and other than the end I was like loving it throughout. But then as soon as I stepped away, I felt like it was more like a 2-star, because actually the plot was a bit of a mess and the romance, which was a big part of the plot, was a mess. So yeah. So then I had a look into her newer book, which is Sorcerers Thorns, which had much better ratings on Goodreads, and this isn't like dark fairy realm, but it is still YA fantasy. So this is set in a completely made up kingdom where our protagonist works in a library. She's an apprentice and she was left there as an orphan, and she is training to be, oh my god, like work in the archives, something to do with that, I can't remember. But anyway, there's an attack at the start of the book, and one of the really old books comes to life, and all these books can talk and they have dark magic in them, and if that dark magic is released, they become these evil beasts that can kill people. And she's accused for releasing this book, and a wizard is sent to collect her for her to go be tried. And in her world, she's told that wizards are completely evil, magic is completely evil, and it's really against what she believes in. And obviously she learns that's not the case, and she falls in love with this guy. Like, we all know this is going to happen. And then like shit ensues, basically. Like more libraries start being attacked, and she starts to piece together the mystery of that, and they realise they're the only people who can like save the world. So I thought the conceit of the like magical library world was really good. Like as a reader, it's lovely to have books front and centre. I thought the world was pretty well realised. Again, she writes really beautifully. Obviously you have the loss of like the seasonal forests in the other book, which I really enjoyed, but the libraries were really well described. There was like cities that were really well described. I think the romance was definitely stronger, and the plot was definitely stronger. I still think the plot is a bit like, there's a couple of just convenient things that don't really make sense. You just think, God, those characters wouldn't have done that. Like there's one point where she's trying to hide because she's an escaped, like accused criminal, but she still uses her real first name when she goes undercover in a library. And her reasoning for that is that, you know, she thinks it'll be difficult to respond to a name that isn't her own, but you're wanted. Like, you definitely wouldn't use your own name. So things like that are just a bit silly. But overall, I really enjoyed this one, and I definitely recommend it if you enjoy your YA fantasy. So there are those 4. Then we have 2 graphic novels I read. So the first one is When I Arrived at the Castle by Emilie Carroll. This is really short, so I'm not going to say much about it. I really enjoyed Emilie Carroll's previous graphic novel, which was a collection of short stories. And I guess this is like similar length to one of those, but on bigger style paper, and she does like horror graphic novels, as you can tell from that. This was a bit weird. I was hoping I'd enjoy this more than I did, and I'm not sure I completely understood it. The basic premise is that this lady goes to a castle to find another woman there, and she's going to kill her. I think you're supposed to understand that the woman at the castle is a vampire, but the woman who's going there to kill her is also some sort of creature, and there's a scene where they're sort of trying to kill one another, but it also looks like a really erotic scene. So I think the artwork was done beautifully, but I think it was just a bit too like symbolic and metaphor heavy for me to really invest in the story. So I enjoyed it. I'm glad I own it because it's beautiful, but I didn't love it as much as I hoped I might. And then the next one is Bloom by Kevin Panetta and Savanna Ganicheau. I probably said that wrong, so I apologise. So this was recommended to me because I really love the Heartstopper graphic novels by Alice Oseman. I don't know how you say her name. And this has a very similar premise in that it's about two young men, I think they're around like 17, 18, who meet one another and have this sort of quiet romance. I really enjoyed this. I think the artwork is better than Heartstopper, so I'll show you the artwork. I love graphic novels that are done all in one colour tone, so I thought this was really beautiful. But I didn't love like the story as much. So this follows two young men, and one of them is trying to start his like indie rock band, and so he wants to move to Baltimore, but his family's bakery is really struggling, and so they need him to stay to keep the business going. So he tries to hire a replacement so that he can leave. Now that was one thing I didn't really understand, because if their reason for wanting him to stay was that the business is struggling, then is it not that he's cheaper to work for them because like he's part of the family and he lives in their home, which is above the bakery? Like, if it's just that he can find someone to replace him, which he does, and then actually they work alongside one another for quite a while, surely that's more expense, because before you coped without him, now you have two people you're having to pay. So that bit didn't really make sense. But anyway, he ends up staying for a while, and him and this guy work together. One thing I really appreciate about this is that it's a really slow romance. For the majority of the graphic novel, they just feel like people who are getting to know one another and becoming really good friends, and quite lonely people who just really like spending time with one another. I also appreciated that, and whilst sometimes it's great to have graphic novels that do things like Heartstopper, right, where one of the characters is really conflicted about his sexuality and he has to really come to terms with that. It's also excellent to not have that, to be able to read a graphic novel where people are openly gay or bisexual and that isn't a conflict. They don't feel like they have to break the news to people. They don't feel like people are going to disown them because of it, and it's just sort of this normal, happy thing. So I really appreciated Bloom for that. And yeah, it was a real joy to read. It was really pleasant, and I really liked the artwork. But as I said, I just don't think the romance was quite as strong as Heartstopper, and I just didn't get quite as much joy out of it. So there is that one. And then I read a short story collection. I actually only finished this on like the 31st of December. This is Sudden Traveller by Sarah Hall. This is a really short collection. I think it only has 6 stories. And I seriously considered DNFing this. Really didn't enjoy the first 2 stories. I thought the first one was really confusing, and also just a bit, like, it felt like it was a bit violent and over the top just for the sake of it, like just to shock you. So that put me off a little bit. And the second one I just found a bit boring. So I really was gonna just give up on it. But then I thought, you know what, it is a short story collection, you could love the third one, and I did. I really liked the third one, which is called The Grotesques, and I also really liked one that's called Autumn, and I quite enjoyed the other 2. So I feel like this is like a 3-star short story collection. 2 of them really didn't enjoy, 2 quite liked, 2 really liked. I'm so up and down with Sarah Hall. Some of her books are glorious, like The Wolf Border is an excellent book and it's her newest novel. Her last short story collection I really loved, but her first short story collection didn't really love that much either, and I think some of her novels are beautifully written but she's not so good on plot. So yeah, she can really write, but sometimes I think she just gets a little bit lost in her words, and actually her stories or her novels don't make all that much sense. So I don't think I'd recommend buying this one. Like, I'm a completist, so I'm collecting all of her books, I'm reading all of them, so I'll keep this one. But I don't feel like I'd have really missed out if I hadn't read it. So there's that one. And then lastly, I read 4 non-fiction books in the month of December. And again, I finished this one right at the end of the month. This is Notes to Self by Emilie Pine. This is an essay collection. This is so short, it's 200 pages, it's really large font, and I think it has about 6 essays in. So it's very shiny. So I guess a bit conflicted about this one. I think I'd give it like 3 stars. The essays are on topics that are personal to her, but topics that would be like applicable to other people. So the first essay, and probably one of the better ones, is called Notes on Intemperance, and it's about the fact that her father was an alcoholic and he got really ill at one point because of that, and he lived on a remote island in Greece and they had to fly out there and try and deal with his medical care in Greece, and deal with him and how he didn't really ever put them first, or, you know, second or third even. That was a really well written essay, I thought. The second one is called From the Baby Years, and it's about the fact that she decided when she was in her mid-30s that she'd really like children, and their struggle for quite a few years in trying to conceive, and their ultimate decision to stop and to not go through IVF because they thought that maybe their relationship wouldn't survive it. And that was, again, really emotive, I felt, and a well-written essay. I think then it got a little bit lost for me. So some of the other essays are about her parents' divorce. There's an essay that I think I probably struggled with the most, which is Something About Me, and it's about her teenage years and how she really sort of went off the rails. She had quite a severe eating disorder, she would sleep out on the streets, she did a lot of drugs, she missed a lot of school, she got kicked out of a couple of schools, and it's about that. Now, here's my issue with that. It's a really hard thing when you read a memoir or an essay collection that's sort of memoirish, not to judge people. But I did find a little bit with some of these essays that she's trying to go for like high emotion, she's trying to make you feel something, and I certainly did with the first 2 essays. But I think with the later ones, it felt a little bit like she was really trying to make her life have been a bit tragic and trying to be like, God, I need something deep and emotional to write about, but I just didn't feel it. I don't know if she didn't really feel it or if she just didn't relay it properly to me. But throughout that essay about her being like that, she kept saying that the reason she was like it was because she was lonely, which is obviously completely valid. But she seemed to pin that back to her parents' divorce, which happened when she was 5. I just don't know, I know it sounds really mean probably, but like people get divorced and it's messy and worse things happen, and there's a point where she like wants to make it really clear how poor they are, and how sometimes her mum can't send her to school with sandwiches and she has to have the free school lunches. I mean, there's plenty of people who never get sent to school with sandwiches and have free school lunches every day and wouldn't even write about it because it's just fucking standard. But then later on, when she tells you about her being kicked out of school, she says her mum finds the money to put her in private school, and then she just glosses over that. Now, I can categorically tell you that there's plenty of people who wouldn't even attempt to dream they could find the money to send their children to private school. It's fine that her mum did, but she should have spent a bit more time articulating how that was and acknowledging the privilege of that, the privilege that she could have messed up school so badly, but yet even though they were struggling, her mum still somehow found the money. You can't go from one page talking about how poor you are to the next page talking about how your parents could afford private school. So that irked me a little bit. So yeah, mixed. There was an essay on here in Periods, which I actually thought was brilliant. She wrote about how in TV adverts all was showing like that blue liquid on tampons and sanitary towels, and why is it so clinical? Why can't they show blood or something that looks like blood? Why are period products called feminine hygiene or sanitary products, which makes it sound like we need these products to be clean, like period blood isn't not clean. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting, but again, when she tries to relate it back to herself, I think sometimes she gets a bit lost. So yeah, mixed feelings about that one. And the same with this one really. So this will be my undoing, Living at the Intersection of Black, Female and Feminist in White America by Morgan Jerkins. So I actually started reading this when I picked it up over a year ago, and then got a few essays in and put it down, not for any particular reason, but I just got caught up in reading other things. So then I found it on Scribd, and I decided to start from the start and listen to it on audio because the author narrated it herself, which I always love. Mixed feelings. Some of these essays are fantastic. She's brutally honest to the point where you probably wouldn't want people knowing that about yourself, and I really admire that. But I had a couple of issues with this. Firstly, a similar issue to what I had with the previous book is that there's a lot of privilege here, and she doesn't really acknowledge it. Her family are fairly wealthy, and she doesn't really acknowledge it, and I think actually the types of people she's trying to write about, there's a whole essay about Harlem and her living there and her not really feeling part of it, and a big reason for that is because of her privilege, the privilege of her wealth, but she doesn't really write about that. The other thing I have an issue with is, and I read other people's reviews on Goodreads who say this like way more articulate, is that a word? They articulate it much better than I'm now going to, but she'll say things about like not generalising and not, not making big assumptions based on people in a group, but then she does that herself. And she'll say things in one essay, and then she'll say something that completely conflicts with it in the other essay. So for example, there was that woman who did the video where she walked through, was it New York, and counted the amount of men who showered things at her. She talks about that, and she talks about the fact that she thinks that some of the things the men said weren't offensive or sexist. They're just saying, "Hi baby, you look great today." Like, she was like, I don't think there's an issue with that. But then in another essay, she talks about when she walked into a corner shop late at night to buy something, and a man comes up to her to try and sell her some tickets, and she makes that into like a massive thing. Like, she felt really trapped by him, and he called her baby. At one point she really didn't like it. It's like, you can't have both those things. You can't feel really offended by a man talking to you in a way that you said somebody could talk to another woman, and that was fine. So in some ways this is excellent, and saying all that, I would follow what she brings out next. She's very young, and I think part of it is that. I think part of it is that she's putting all these thoughts on the page, and she's not necessarily taking a step back and realising that some of the things she says are just a little bit privileged and also a little bit conflicting. And I think she's a really strong writer, and I definitely think she's someone to watch. So I don't regret reading this, and again, I thought the audiobook was great. Another one I listened to on audiobooks, I don't actually have a copy of this, although I'll definitely be picking one up, is My Time Among the Whites, Notes from an Unfinished Education by Jennine, Capó, Crucet. I really enjoyed this one. It's a very short audiobook. I think it was only about 5 or 6 hours, and it's narrated by the author. And this is again a memoir in essays, and this is set out thematically. So this is about the fact that Jennine is a first generation Cuban American, and she's the first person in her family to go to college. And the first essay opens with her telling you about her going to college and how her family went with her for initiation, and they assumed they would stay like for a couple of weeks, and how like no one really explained that, because the expectation is someone else who's gone to college, and so you don't need these things to be told to you. And it's like this excruciating moment where her family are just sort of wandering around campus, really confused by the fact that they're the only parents left there. There's a whole essay on Disney World, which is completely unexpected but brilliant. I think it's one of the best essays in there, and it's about the fact that they lived really close to Disney World in Florida, and so they'd go there for weekends, and her connection with this place that's so artificial and artificially peddles the American dream, this place that's actually really embedded in racist stereotypes, and how, as now like a professor herself, she still can't step away from her love for Disney, and her really grappling with that. It was brilliant. It was really nostalgic. Even for a life that obviously I hadn't led. There's also a whole essay on marriage and how she's now divorced, but she did marry a white man, and trying to plan that wedding knowing that loads of her Cuban American relatives would be there, and they would have certain expectations of what her wedding should have, particularly as pertains to the DJ, but also she didn't want to make her Cuban American relatives a spectacle for the white American relatives of her soon-to-be husband there. So it's this really fine balance which is really difficult for her to tread. That was really interesting. So I think this is brilliantly articulated memoir and essays. I'd highly recommend it. I give this like 4.5 stars. This was very nearly one of my favourite books of the year, and the only reason it isn't is, again, I have a big issue with this in books, is that she doesn't, well, two things, and this first one is a really small criticism. I just think it could have been a bit longer. I think it could have had a bit more depth, and I think it could have had a bit more, I don't know, I just think it could have been a bit more detailed. But that's a small criticism. The bigger one, and the real reason I knocked a 1/2 star, is because she also doesn't acknowledge her privilege, okay? So she gets into a few colleges, and one of those colleges offers her a full scholarship. She turns it down. She gets into a more prestigious college, don't remember which one, and she doesn't get offered a full scholarship, and so her parents remortgage their house in order for her to go. And there's a big conflict there, her talking about whether that was the wrong decision and whether she'd be in exactly the same place as she is now if she'd gone to the college with a full scholarship, and how she really came to that decision with her family. But at no point does she acknowledge that it's an amazing thing, a privileged place to be, that your parents have already paid off their mortgage when you're only like 18. There's not a lot of families, I don't think, that could say that. So I just think at certain points she needed to like acknowledge that whilst certainly when her parents came to America, they were very young and they had no money and they really built themselves up. She also talks a lot about the privilege of being white, but just like one more paragraph in that section would have made me sit more comfortably with it. So I think it's just something I have an issue with. I don't like when I feel like the privilege of wealth is really often unacknowledged, and I think it just should have been acknowledged. So there's that. But I really enjoyed it, and I'd highly recommend it, and I've since picked up her novel because I just want to read everything she's written. So the last book I'm going to talk about is Heavy, an American memoir by Kiese Laymon. So I pronounced his name wrong in my last couple of videos, and what happened is I did my Christmas book haul. I got his novel Long Division for Christmas, and I got this out of the library a week or so before, and I decided to watch an interview with him because I was like, I'm sure I'm saying his name wrong, it just doesn't feel right. I was saying Kiese Laymon, I think, and anyway, I watched an interview and he was introduced as Kiese. And anyway, I only meant to watch a few minutes, and I watched a 45-minute interview. Absolutely fucking phenomenal. I will link it down below. And I was like, I'm gonna go pick up the book now, and I did, and I read like half of it that night at like 11 o'clock at night. And I finished it the next day, and this was absolutely fucking fantastic. It is a brilliant book. And I've since watched so many interviews with him. Amazing. In the interview I'm gonna link, there's a part where he reads out from the book, and as soon as I heard him do that, I was like, oh my god, like I have to read this. I now really want to listen to this on audio as well because his inflections just add so much. But I'm really glad I read this in print because it's beautifully written. So initially he agreed with a publisher to write a book about his struggles with weight and how that tied into him being a black man from Mississippi, and like the diet of his mother and his grandmother, and how that led to his weight, and how that was really tied into the culture of black people in Mississippi. When he started to write that book, he realised that wasn't really the book he wanted to write, and instead he wanted to write about not only just the physicality of being heavy, but being heavy as in emotionally heavy, and the weight of like memories that he took on from his relatives. So this is, oh my god, it's just absolutely fantastic. This is sort of split into a few parts. The first section is this is told in chronological order. The first section is about his childhood. He has a really tumultuous relationship with his mother. It's quite hard to read at points. His mother was violent towards him in the home, and she was also in an abusive relationship with a man, which you hear about within the book. And then you hear about his teen years and the schools he goes to. He comes from a school that's nearly all African American students, and then he's moved to a school that is nearly all white students. And that was probably one of my favourite chapters. That's called Meager, and it's about him and his relationship with this friend he has, who's the only other black boy in his class, and just the conversations they have, they just annihilate everybody else in their class, the way they describe their teachers, the way they're spoken to, the way they're treated. Throughout this, I'm not going to articulate this properly. He writes beautifully about his mother and his grandmother, particularly in that his mother was abusive to him, and then in later years he writes about becoming a university professor, a college professor, and in being incredibly successful, but then his mother earning even more money than him, because his mother is also a very successful academic, but still calling him for money all the time, and basically the lies he finds out about. And this is really about the lies that they tell one another and how he even lies to himself. And in the interviews I've watched, it's really interesting because, you know, I've never watched anyone be interviewed who actually feels like they're still coming up with new thoughts on the stage. There's quite a few times he's asked questions and he's like, do you know what, like, I've just thought something, but I think that might be too much to say here, because I've just realised this thing about myself. And he's obviously so emotionally intelligent. And this is, just absolutely phenomenally written. So yeah, I truly want everybody to read this, and it's really unusual for me to I read predominantly books by women, if you haven't noticed, and even if I do read a book by a man, I don't tend to read books by men that really discuss masculinity. And Kiese is a very masculine man. I don't think he ever tries to hide that. There's whole sections where he talks about the fact that he never tries to be less than. So lots of his African American friends, including his family, tell him he needs to stop. He needs to hold back. When they're pulled over by police, he needs to not answer back because he's endangering himself and others around him, and he never does. He articulates throughout the novel that he always wants to like stand up, fight and win. And I don't often read books that where people live like that or have that mindset, but actually the way he delivers it and the way he articulates it is, I don't know how I can describe this. It's absolutely brilliant. Everybody should read it. And I could just reread it right now. Like, I loved it. I cried at sad moments, happy moments. I cried just sometimes because of how beautiful, like heart-achingly beautiful the writing was. So yeah, please read this book and go watch interviews with him, because he's such an interesting person to listen to. So yeah, rambled for ages. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you read any of these books. Let me know what you read in December, and let me know if you have any recommendations based on the books I just spoke about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.